Hi, my name's Colby and you are watching one of my 10-minute tutorials. Here is our 10-minute tutorial for today. I am going to show you how to make a sunflower in watercolor. Welcome to my next 10-minute tutorial. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to paint a sunflower. This photo is from Unsplash, the photography app where photographers can upload their photos and anyone can use them for free. So thank you for Jirasine Yosri for letting us use this photo today. So first, before I paint any kind of flower or anything really, I like to analyze the photo. And so we're not going to paint any of these background sunflowers. We're just going to paint this open sunflower right here, including the stem and the leaves. So sunflowers have a really large center, which I believe is the ovum of a flower. I really don't know. I'm not a botanist. But so sunflowers have this really large brown center that kind of is a bunch of circles. So there's one smaller circle, and then other layers of like varying colors and textures, and then some small leaves poking out from the sides, and then obviously the yellow sunflower petals. So I think the most important thing when I'm painting sunflowers to remember is to make this as big as it needs to be, and that the petals aren't that big really, aren't that long in comparison. It kind of looks like the petals are not even as long as the center of the flower is. So short petals, large center. That's what we need to remember for a sunflower. We're going to do our best to replicate this. Let's get started. So before I like to start painting the actual flower, I like to break it down into the pieces that I think are going to be harder to capture. And so for us, in this case, I think that is mostly going to be the petals of the sunflower and the leaves, because those are hard shapes. So for the petals of the sunflower, we're going to paint one stroke petals, okay? So we're going to start, and it's going to be thin, thick, thin in terms of pressure. So we're going to start with very thin pressure, not very much pressure at first, and then we're going to push down on our paintbrush. So that's the thick part, and then lift up. And that is how we're going to form all of the petals on our flower. And some of the petals, the tricky part with flowers is to capture the natural movement. And so when you're painting the petals, sometimes you might want to paint them perfectly straight out like that, which is fine. But you also need to remember to give some petals a little movement like that. And the way that you do that really is by just slightly moving your wrist a little bit toward the end or in the middle as you're painting the petals. And now let's try painting some leaves. So I'm going to take some green, and this thin, thick, thin stroke that we remember, we're going to use 2 of those to form our leaf. So first, I like to paint the stem, and then I paint one side of the leaf using that same stroke we did, and then I paint the other side of the leaf. But I don't paint it from exactly the same spot on the stem. I like to paint it a little bit outward from the stem and then have it meet the flower, because the white space, this is loose watercolor, these are loose watercolor florals, the white space is going to act like the vein of the leaf. So instead of painting like a super realistic leaf, we are going to use negative space to give that leaf some characteristic. And the same for the leaves goes for the petals, okay? So we sometimes want them to be straight, sometimes we want them to have a little bit of movement. The petals that we might try to paint for this sunflower might even have a little side action going. So let's keep those in mind. And now let's move on to the actual flower. First, we're going to start with the center of the flower, and then starting from the center, while the center is still wet, we're going to paint the first layer of petals, okay? And then we're going to add details to the center and paint the next layer of petals, and finally we're going to paint the stem and the leaves. So let's get started. Okay, so I have some brown on my paintbrush, and I'm just actually going to flip this around so that our practice is on this side because I'm right-handed. So I have some brown, and I'm going to paint basically a circle. I'm not perfect at painting circles, but I'm going to paint basically a circle and another lighter circle in the middle, like that. So the trick here, because we know that the center of the flower looks like it has circles kind of stacked on top of each other, is to keep that circular texture going. So I want to have, I'm going to add more texture once this is dry, using the wet on dry technique, but I still want to, while this is wet, make it almost look like there's like a lighter circle in the middle and then this darker circle all around. And if you do that while the paint is still wet, so you paint the circle and then add more color or take it away as you go, then the paint will blend in with itself, and that's called using the wet on wet technique. So while it's still wet, I'm going to take my yellow and starting on this edge, just make my petals. And remember not to make them too big. So they don't all have to be the same size also. And they don't have to necessarily be right next to each other. See, we're going to do multiple layers of these petals all on top of each other. That's how we're going to capture that cool layered look of a sunflower. We're going to start with those with some petals going around, and then once they're dry, we're going to paint even more in multiple layers around and around until the sunflower is completely filled in. So here's a little time lapse of that. Okay, so we've completed our petals, and now the next step is to fill in the details and of the flower and then move on to the stem. So first, the details of the inside of the flower. As we see when we use our reference photo, it mostly just looks like a bunch of little dots all up in this center, right? And so we're going to use the wet on dry technique, meaning using paint, watercolor, to paint on a dry surface, to paint just a bunch of little dots in a circle. That's the key with sunflowers, is to make sure you stay in the circle. So here's a little time lapse of that. Okay, interrupting the time lapse a little bit to note also that you don't have to stay within the confines of the circle. The center of the flower is, honestly, it looks a little, jagged around the edges, and so use the dots also as a way to make the center of the flower just a little more realistic by adding some texture so you don't have those like smooth circle lines that flowers don't really have on the inside. So, okay, back to our time lapse. Okay, so now that we've completed the inside of the sunflower, notice I did a bunch of brown dots, some green dots in the middle, and then some black dots to kind of round it off. Let's finish this sunflower by painting the stem and the leaves. So I'm going to take some green and I'm going to paint basically from the center down just a thin little stem that curves out a little bit. And then I'm going to paint my leaves using the methods that we practiced before. So I just paint a little line for the stem of the leaf, and then 2 little crescent strokes like that. And I'm going to even paint one leaf like it's coming out at me, like that. I'll show you the reference photo in just a second. See that leaf right there? It looks like it's coming out of me almost. So that's the inspiration for that. And then I think I'm just going to do one more little one like this. Well, a few more little ones like that, just to show sunflowers can have lots of leaves. Okay, so this is my sunflower. Just a quick little project, a few steps that don't take very long, but you can come up with this bright and sunny, loose sunflower. If this tutorial was fun for you, please let me know in the comments, and if you wanted to give it a try, I would love to see. So thank you for following along, and see you next time.